Welcome to the module on transformative shifts in organizational processes. The concept of the transformational dynamics basically refers to the long-term change in the economic activity. The economic activity is a transition from primitive agriculture to the industry and finally to the services. Whenever we refer to any sort of economic activity, the dominance of that activity basically rules up in the primitive stages. So particularly for any underdeveloped nation, it starts the journey from the primitive agriculture, who actually specializes in the manufacturing and thereby goes to the services. So this basically refers to a lot of engagements with other sectors of the economy, making a synergy between the two units and thereby making the rapid economic development or a holistic structure of the economy as a whole. This also refers to the employment of the abled individuals. Here the term abled individuals is very important because it refers to the skilled labor force or the skilled workers that are required to stimulate this type of developmental process. So basically in the factors of production we have land, labor, capital and organization. So any kind of economic activity begins with the stress on the land, and this land is basically used up for the primitive agriculture, which is then manufactured in terms of setting up of industries, and thereby the economic activity takes the process. So this process of economic activity is a dynamic and basically involves a lot of transformational shifts in terms of organizational decision making. This refers to the concept of the transformational dynamics, which refers to a long-term change in the dominant economic activity, whereby agriculture is considered to be the dominant, in terms of prevailing relative engagement. Here relative engagement means with the development process, the engagement of the agriculture gets declining, with more engagement in the industries and finally taken over by the services, followed by the employment of the abled individuals or the skilled individuals actually. Now we refer to how human economic systems perform. It's a synergy between two words, human and economic systems. Basically, it refers to a kind of a symbiotic relationship between these two entities, which involves a number of deviations from the normal state, trend or development. Because any kind of transformative change brings a structural break in the economy, and thereby the agricultural domain gets carried away by the industry and finally by the services. This also results to a lot of shocks, which is referred as disturbance, which can be short-term disruptions or temporary disorder. So this temporary disorder can be executed in the initial stage and finally it can get assimilated over the time, or it may fade away with the long-term process. However, there can be persistent or repeated divergence which can be alarming in terms of a decline or a crisis. So this is basically how the transformational dynamics brings with it the disturbance as well as the persistent shocks, and also it leads to how the normal economic development moves on. This basically refers to more stages of these organizational processes, which refers to deformation. Deformation actually means a kind of a damage which occurs in selected sectors of the nation, whereby the loss of self-sustainability comes in. Because here the self-sustainability refers to a power of resilience which a nation needs to develop. But any kind of disruption resulting from organizational changes may be also shocking in terms of loss of sustainability or in terms of a permanent damage. However, the transformation is always a long-term change which actually results to restructuring of the entire process from where it began and what is the objective in the long run. And basically we can use the term new normal under the context of this transformation, because already the nation starts with a normal state, and with the advent of various multifaceted factors, the economy operates on a new normal state which can be a transformed state, which is also taken over by the word of renewal, which means rebirth, transmutation. Corso ricorso is basically a kind of deformation and thereby the transformation, renaissance or a new beginning. So this new beginning can come up with more ideas, more thought processes, and as a result of that, it will make a new economic system to develop in synergy with the humans. So in overall terms, we can say transformation is the change in the economic activity, and this change basically starts from the deformation, and that leads to the transformation and finally to the rebirth or the renaissance, or in terms of renewal. This basically brings us to the drivers of this production growth. Because any kind of transformational process basically involves the change in the economic activity, and any change in economic activity basically has an objective of the rise in the productivity growth. So the word productivity is basically refers to the contribution of each of the factors of production in the entire political economic processes. So productivity growth is actually fueled by advances in technology. As we can say that technological upgradation, or in order to come up with a major technical expertise, is basically being important for the productivity parameter. And that is how the productivity growth comes in. Inflow of useful innovations. When we refer to any kind of innovations, it basically refers to cost reduction, basically refers to skill upgradation, and moreover, it deals with more and more engagement of the human in terms of skill formation. So any such kind of innovations is the result of a technological induction or the technological event. Accumulated practical knowledge and expertise. This is basically a kind of a learning curve where every nation operates. Because with the accumulation of experience over time, and also with the exposure to the practical field, productivity is actually fueled and thereby gets transmitted with various organizational processes or at different junctions of organizational activities. This definitely involves political structure. Because whenever we talk about a political structure, it basically refers to the changes in the governance, in the political stability, and also it refers to the entire autonomy or any kind of dominance that the state or the government of the center enjoys. So this basically refers to issues in the governance. So whenever we talk about a good governance or a kind of a governance model, we basically refer to the law and order, we refer to the voice, accountability, transparency, and moreover the political stability. So basically any kind of driver of production growth is fueled up by technology, innovation, skill, that is knowledge, political structure, and definitely political structure is overlapping with the issues of a good governance. This also refers to other social parameters which govern the entire nation. The social parameters mainly refer to the level of education. So education is a merit good, which thereby looks into the primary education, secondary and the tertiary, and that has to be transmitted among the different corners of the country. Viability of institutions also play an important role. That is the feasibility of an institutional setup, which is called public institutional capital or the social overheads. This basically refers to the social infrastructure, the good governance models, and also taking care of the corporate issues in this regard. Quality of decision making and organized human effort. This is very crucial because decision making plays an important role in all the activities starting from the initial stage of underdevelopment to the stage of maturity. Because decision making cannot be done by only one individual, it takes into processes the opinions or the entire managerial decision of all the stakeholders. This also refers to an organized human effort in a coordinated manner. So organized human effort refers to how a good coordination can be done among the different skills that are available in the nation. Individual sector transformations are the outcomes of human socio-economic evolution. So whenever we can take up at the micro level or the individual level, whether the individual is better off in its living style or in standard of living, or a decent standard of living is followed up by the individual, then only we can talk about the socio-economic transformations. And if the socio-economic transformations are coming up in a better way, then only we can call for a good society or a kind of an equitable society to work in. This type of drivers of growth basically results to different types of capital that are embedded in the structure. When we talk about the capital, first we refer to the natural capital. Natural capital is very much linked up with the environmental resources. So by the environmental resources, we mean the nature produced, renewed and reproduced in terms of land, water, air, biomass and organisms. So when we talk about the biodiversity, when we talk about the environmental phenomena or environmental parameters, we basically take up the steps to actually make it sustainable, particularly in terms of the renewable and the non-renewable sources of energy. So this basically refers to how the nature can produce all these type of resources in a holistic manner so that the land, water, air can be taken up together from a protective world and thereby can be given more impetus for future development. This also refers to the organisms in terms of the species or in terms of the endangered species which needs to be preserved, because these are also contributors of any transformational shift in any society. Next, we move on to the built capital, which is referred as the physical capital. So this basically refers to the physical assets that we talk about. These are infrastructures, which mainly refer to the equipment, the machinery. Also, it takes care of the land and also the capital. Technologies, which are very important in the process in terms of the technological innovations. Buildings and means of transportation. So when we talk about the means of transportation, basically refers to the connectivities, either in the water transport or in the surface transport or in the air transport, because this calls for a good coordination among the transporting entities. So basically when we refer to any kind of organizational capacity, which is referred in the transformative process, basically refers to the national hardware, which needs to be maintained, renewed, and also needs to be modernized as per the current standards. And that calls for an upgradation. So any such upgradation will definitely come up with continued productivity. So this productivity is basically measured by productivity per worker. Efficiency parameter is very important in terms of the market forces, in terms of meeting the demand side of the economy, and effectiveness. Effectiveness basically refers to the benefits that all this type of capital would like to reap to the entire population. Then only we can say that the organizational processes or whatever shift has come up in the organizational transformation has been successful. This basically refers to more types of capital apart from this, that is human capital. Human capital is a continuous investment. It is basically a never-ending process because that requires for upgradation in knowledge, upgradation in skills in order to get apt with the modern dynamic society. So it's a continued effort that has to be taken up by the individual level as well as by the collective level, because this calls for proper skill formation, calls for the dissemination of the knowledge. Not only the knowledge needs to be accumulated, it needs to be disseminated across the corners of the society. Education plays an important role in all these things to happen because it acts as a catalyst. Health and nutrition are also considered to be one of the most important components of human capital today in the sustainability development goals, because we talk about a kind of a decent health standards and a proper nutritional standards. So this nutrition calls for the proper diet intake in terms of the calories, fats and proteins. A balanced diet basically calls for. And also the health parameters in terms of hygiene takes up a pivotal role. Moreover, we talk about the abilities, because opportunities can be there, but the individual should be capable to exploit those opportunities. And this calls for the ability formation, motivation and effort, because motivation is basically the willingness that the individual can get to do, and this willingness or motivation basically is driven by a good health standards, a decent standard of living and a proper dietary structure. So all these are embedded within the canvas of human capital. Next, we move on to the social capital, which is properly called social institutional capital. This is basically referred to the civic communities, the basic civic order, the law and order systems, also taking care of the cultural and the national cohesion, because we are basically experiencing changes in the national cultures as a result of the transformative process. Because majority of the transformative process are influenced by the globalization or the global forces, and thereby there creates a kind of a friction between the domestic culture and the foreign culture. So this calls for a good cohesion between the two in terms of community and restoration of the family values. That is, a value system should come up in terms of trust, in terms of traditions and sense of belonging. So when we talk about the sense of belonging, it basically refers to the ownership rights that are called for. And finally, we talk about the political capital, which is the political governance of a nation. Because any sort of political governance is called for the overall functioning of all the capitals in a peaceful manner. Because the world also tries for a call of a good economy in terms of peace restoration. So that is also very much important when all these capital actually work in a synergy. None of the types of the capital is in isolation. They work together for the holistic development. Now we move on to the parallelism of crisis and transformations. This is basically one of the practical facts that any transformation process also brings in certain adversities, which is captured by the emergence of the crisis, which can have a short-term or a long-term effect. Whenever we talk about any kind of transformation, the most important issue that triggers is inducing the catharsis of a crisis, which coincides with the undistinguishable from the triggers launching qualitative transformations of economy, business, and society at large. So what do we mean by these qualitative transformations? Qualitative transformations are basically the visible transformations of an economy. Basically in terms of more and more high rises as a result of urbanization that takes up the environmental concern, because environmental issues are compromised at some times. Then we talk about the business activities, which are basically driven by high-end services, which basically gives actually place for very high-skilled laborers and also crowds out the unskilled or the semi-skilled section of the community, and basically the transformative changes in the culture or in terms of the advent of the foreign cultures in the society. So all this creates a kind of a frictions initially to come up with this economy. Moreover, we see that the developed and the mature economies of the world, that is the advanced nations of the world like USA, Japan and Western Europe, all of them has undergone a long-term transformation from a new normal of doing business, state governance and ways of life. So they have rapidly picked up all these changes as a result of technology, as a result of cultural mix, and more importantly in terms of the algorithms driven by the technology or the efficiency-driven growth. And thereby they have adapted to the word of the new normal, as they have said. This also includes a kind of a deformation or a reformation from their existing standards. So cyclical crisis is a parallel accompanying phenomena which comes up in an alternative manner and which has different rules, different causes and separate dynamics. So when we talk about the separate dynamics, it basically refers to a cyclical crisis that comes in, and that is very much parallel in nature because in terms of the transformations that calls for. So any kind of transformation that operates within the economy basically comes up with all the societies and how these societies work hand in hand, and how the economy can firstly adapt to this changing style. Moreover, the unrecognized confluence of the crisis and transformation and inability to separate them lies at the core of old tools not working properly. This is basically a kind of an anti-globalization sentiment that sometimes crops up in the minds of the policymakers. Because the confluence of the change with new ideas and with the existing structure is not simple. It's a complicated process. So thereby some kind of unrecognition may take place initially in order to cope up with the new culture, new domains, which takes time. And thereby the old thoughts, or the conservatism that the economy has or the nation has gets attacked. So thereby the tools for adapting successfully to this paradigmatic transformation have not been developed. So it has been seen in some of the nations of Western Europe, in some of the nations of Africa and the sub-Saharan economies that this type of adapting mechanism has been quite sluggish because they are used with the existing cultures and adaptation to the new cultures takes time. Persistent rates of unemployment, falling workforce participation indicate that the crisis is intertwined with the underlying transformation. As it is said that the transformation sometimes occurs at a very rapid rate. This basically refers to more and more jobs, but it takes up a selected proportion of the population because they are looking for a specialized skill which the entire population cannot deliver, and it actually relies on a highly educated skilled labor force. So actually any labor surplus economy has to experience this, and the consequence is unfortunate because it leads to persistent rates of unemployment, which basically reflected with the workforce participation rate to fall. So the crisis is basically interlinked with any kind of underlying transformation. So this is a very much typical dynamics which has a persistence effect. New challenges come up, and thereby the business practices also need to change up with the dynamism, and the government intervened as a toolbox because government has to step in, the civic communities have to step in to protect the economy from any such kind of global forces, because in majority of the times they are carried away influenced by the dominant players across the globe. This basically refers to sector dynamics. So sector dynamics is a consequence of the transformation. What is that? Because the consequence of the transformation is evolution of multiple sectors in the economy in terms of employment levels. Because it refers to a medium scale enterprises, refers to highly technologically driven enterprises, and also refers to some of the enterprises which have the capacity to absorb larger proportion of unskilled labor. So basically they can actually engage some fluctuations, but economic sectors evolve. Secondly, they emerge because these are the new things. Sometimes they go for an expansion because of the other investments or other sectors to contribute. A kind of a plateau also comes in where stagnancy results because of too much of development at a rapid pace, and after that the development gets stuck. Contract also occurs in sometimes with the other sectors and exit. So it is just like a living organism where all these steps come up, and this calls for self-organizational structure. So how this total structure gets employed in the sector, how these dynamic changes take place, so the new jobs are created, old ones are abandoned, and that is how the transformative process works on. So with the growth of the new ideas, the old thoughts are getting faded away, and that thereby calls for a new dynamism or a new transformative structure. Moreover, we can say that the sector's percentage of employment evolves in the dependency on sector's productivity growth rate, because the sector actually contributes a lot. For example, in Indian economy, it is seen that moreover with the advent of technology, the entire growth rate is driven by the service sector. So thereby the dependency on this sector is also alarming in this regard, where the other sectors are basically showing a falling percentage or a proportion. Agriculture has emerged initially, but over the time of progression, both economically and politically, the stance of agriculture has disappeared as a source of net employment. So it is seen that in terms of the proportion to the overall aggregate product, either in terms of the share or in terms of the employment proportion, it has been seen the falling share of agriculture. Manufacturing has also come up. It has come up to its peak. Services have also emerged. So as a result of this, these are the unavoidable and the desirable productivity growth rates which have come up. So any kind of disruptions that is a follow-up or that is basically intertwined with any transformative process deals with all these kind of unavoidable or inevitable consequences. It has been seen that with this result of dynamics, public sector has been emerging in all the nations. Public sector is basically taken up to take care of the society and not driven by the profit maximization. So it is basically a welfare-oriented entity which is under the autonomy of the government based on the financing mechanism, that is the finances or the revenue that has to be generated to tax, and thereby it contributes to the production sector. It also provides a kind of a protection or a shield from the fluctuation in the global market forces, and definitely contributes to the generation of public goods. That is what they are saying, the public services. So creating employment in the sector is achievable, but it has to be taken up at the expense of the productive sectors. So this is very much important, how the creation of employment occurs, and this employment refers to the livelihood creations as a result of these dynamics. So sustaining employment growth is very much important, but it is limited by the growth of debt financing. Because in most of the nations it is seen that the debt financing mechanisms work in order to survive the growth with a lot of ambitious projects taken up, but there has been shortage in the resource generation. So as a result of that, the nation has to depend upon the debts to survive or to struggle with the existing projects. So this is basically how the sector dynamics perform after the result of transformation. This basically refers to the 4 basic sectors which basically operate on this stage, like they go for transformations in terms of agriculture, industry, service, government, welfare, and unemployment. So all of them works on the production of the food, which is actually in the primitive stage. Then they go for manufactured foods. After that, they go for the provision of the services, networking, which comes up with the engagement of the labor force, and finally calls for the distribution. So that is how we can see how these 4 basic sectors operate for the holistic development of the economy. And with this new normal, we call for the new transformation. So whenever we talk about a new society to evolve in terms of the renaissance or in terms of a new beginning, we basically take care of all the transformations comes in, which may take care of public and private participations. So basically it follows 3 steps. Firstly, it starts at the local level where the decision making takes place, carry forwarded to the global level, and after this global level, some of the inputs are also coming up in the backward direction from the global to the local, and that's why it calls for relocalization. So there has been continuous stress or a continuous ambitious project or a drive for increased productivity growth rates. Declining employment and workforce participation. So these are some of the risk factors associated with the transformative process. Because any kind of transformative process should not come up with the decline in the employment, thereby it should have a balancing act. And also it has been seen that any kind of transformative process actually depends on huge level of automation and also on the outsourcing. So when we talk about automation, we basically refers to declining employment, and that is absolutely alarming in terms of this new transformation. This also refers to a kind of a synergy between self-service, disintermediation, and customization. What does it mean? These 3 terms basically refers to a new transformational paradigm. So when we are operating or making a shift from the conservative society to a more sophisticated and a consumeristic society, then 3 words come in. One is the self-service, which means self-sufficiency in the growth parameters. Disintermediation basically refers to a kind of a direct linkage between the producer and the consumer without giving more and more stress on the middle level workers or the middle level agents. Basically, the mass customization is also important both at the local and the regional levels. It is seen that the high productivity growth sectors' foods are getting cheaper. This also may occur as a result of transformation, and the products of the healthcare education are becoming expensive. So it is a very interesting or a rather alarming picture as a result of the transformation to any political society. So modern production is primarily based on information processing in terms of goods, humans, machineries, and that is how the transformation comes in. So when we talk about the transformation, basically refers to the sophistication in the entire business activities. Relocalization is also important because it refers to a kind of a globalization that takes place, which takes place in a different way because it involves supply chains, which are basically the driving forces for creating the new demand. Large economies are focusing on it, and thereby a kind of a back sourcing takes place. That means any kind of export can also be reoriented in terms of the demand of the foreign country. So thereby the globalization refers to the relocalization which is distributed to the localized economy. Consumption and the entire pattern also of the national economies go on a change in terms of political states and a global change. People are basically moving to a kind of relocalization. And finally, global experience and knowledge becomes embodied in the local communities. And that is how the mix of culture and the mix of traditions comes in, with more and more global experience and knowledge peeping in. So here we basically discuss about the backdrop of the transformation, which is a dynamic process which brings in the role of technology, innovations, changes in the social structure and the political structure, and more importantly, a drive towards a new normal. Types of capital are also taken up which are overlapping and they're interlinked with each other in terms of the nature capital, physical capital, human capital, and technological capital. Sector dynamics takes place with new sectors evolving which are correlated with each other. Relocalization means how the local thought process can get adaptable to the new technology. And finally, the new definition of transformation is a new beginning, which calls for new normal in this process. So thereby the organizational processes go for a rapid change in this transformative structure, which is instrumental for propagating a larger trajectory or a higher trajectory in the growth process of economic development.